the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. We cannot live without clean air or clean water, and this week we'll discuss what are arguably the most important environmental regulations. They are important not only because of what they protect, but they also represent the first major modern federal responses to the deteriorating environmental conditions faced by our country and the planet at this time. The Clean Air Act, the CAA, was signed into law in 1970 and was the first major piece of environmental legislation. Much of the most toxic air emissions at this time were visible, spewing from smokestacks and tailpipes. It was apparent to most that these conditions were unhealthy and action needed to be taken. The 1970 CAA and the subsequent 1977 and 1990 amendments imposed strict requirements on regulated sources. The CAA required all states to create plans to carry out the provisions of the Act. The EPA must approve these state implementation plans, or SIPs. Funding to the states to carry out the requirements is contingent on EPA approval of their SIPs and their operating program. The 1970 CAA imposed regulations on the most notorious pollutants. These pollutants were designated as criteria pollutants and are the following: carbon monoxide, lead, oxides of nitrogen, ozone, particulate matter, sulfur dioxide. For each of these pollutants, the EPA developed acceptable levels or standards. These standards are called the National Ambient Air Quality Standard, NAAQS. These standards are reviewed each year, and based on scientific evidence, the standards are adjusted to reflect the best information on what acceptable levels of pollutants the population can be safely exposed to. When developing acceptable levels, the EPA considers the most vulnerable populations: the young, those with pre-existing conditions, the elderly, and expecting mothers. Sources of air pollutants are divided into mobile vehicles and stationary sources such as power plants. In either case, the limits based on the NAAQS apply to both sources. The Clean Air Act also regulates by existing conditions. Areas that are considered to be in attainment with the NAAQS usually have less polluting sources and good quality air. Those that do not meet one or more part of the NAAQS are considered non-attainment. It is more difficult to obtain an air pollutant permit in non-attainment areas, as the national goal is to prevent further deterioration of air quality. Permits granted to sources in non-attainment areas are typically more stringent than those in attainment areas. The 1970 CAA allowed certain categories of existing air pollutant sources to operate less efficiently than new sources. However, the pre-CAA permitted sources could not undergo major modifications to the polluting equipment unless the new equipment met the more stringent standards for new sources. Another provision of the CAA was the Prevention of Significant Deterioration PSD program. New major sources or existing sources undergoing major modifications must demonstrate the source conforms to the ambient air quality levels to prevent deterioration of air quality and use the best available control technology for each pollutant. The 1990 Clean Air Act amendments greatly expanded the scope of the regulations. Nearly 190 compounds were designated as toxic or hazardous air pollutants, HAPS or HAPs. When 10 tons of any single HAP or 25 tons of multiple air toxics are emitted from a permitted source, and a permitted source can have multiple discharge points as typical of most large industrial complexes or power generating plants, controls must be put into place. The 1990 amendments also imposed limits on emissions of chemicals contributing to acid precipitation and to those affecting the stratospheric ozone layer. The Act mirrored the international treaty, the Montreal Protocol, where ozone layer depleting substances would be phased out and replaced with those that produce less damage to the ozone layer. The first generation of substitutes were only interim and have also been replaced by a new generation of even safer compounds. The ozone layer depleting substances include widely used refrigerants for air conditioners and refrigerators. The CAA has been successful in reducing pollutants and providing cleaner air. However, the greatest threat to the planet from global climate change compounds is not directly by the CAA, but rather through executive orders or by interpretation of parts of the original Clean Air Act. It does not appear there will be any new legislation addressing global climate change emissions anytime soon. The Clean Water Act, or CWA, was approved by Congress in 1972, riding the same wave of public concerns as the CAA. However, President Nixon vetoed the act, and it required a congressional override for the act to become law. In spite of its passage, Nixon withheld some of the funding to implement parts of the act. The CWA required discharge standards on an industry-specific basis according to appropriate control technologies and cost considerations. Similar to the CAA, sources of water discharges were required to obtain a permit. The National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, NPDES, permits required enforceable limitations. Monthly reports had to be submitted to the government reporting on the concentration of chemicals and other parameters taken at intervals mandated in the site-specific permits. Exceedances of permit limits could result in fines or penalties. The Clean Water Act established a national policy prohibiting the discharge of toxic pollutants in toxic amounts. The following goals were also established: end the release of pollutants into the surface waters, improve water quality that provides for the propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and for recreation in and on the water. The original act focused on point source, that is, where devices or conveyances such as pipe, ditches, or gullies transport a water discharge into a body of water. There is much focus on discharges from wastewater or sewage plants. At this time, many wastewater plants perform minimal treatment of sewage prior to discharge into surface waters. These discharges were in large part responsible for polluting the Great Lakes, the largest source of fresh water in the U.S. and Canada. The Great Lakes were considered to be dying due to nutrient overloading, especially from phosphorus. Much of the phosphorus came from laundry detergent. Reducing and eliminating phosphorus from detergents greatly reduces the problem. The Great Lakes continue to face numerous problems from persistent organic compounds and invasive species. The CWA regulated discharges to navigable waterways. Navigable waters are defined as waters used for interstate commerce, including lakes, rivers, streams, and wetlands. These waters may be used for recreation and are the source of fish and shellfish sold in interstate commerce. It also includes water used for industrial purposes. Impoundments and tributaries, including wetlands adjacent to these categories, are also included. The wetland provisions have been the most controversial part of the law, and there have been several court cases, including some at the U.S. Supreme Court, to provide interpretation. Different presidential administrations have also weighed in on how to enforce this section of the law. While the original CWA was effective in reducing pollutant loading from point sources, non-point sources are now the most prevalent and difficult source of pollutants flowing into surface waters. It is much more difficult to treat surface waters as they originate wherever there is a rain event which carries pollutants from agricultural operations, roadways, and other developed areas into surface waters. The 1987 Water Quality Act created regulations and a permitting system for stormwater discharges. This provision is primarily administered by the states. The CWA, like the CAA, took many positive advances to reduce pollutant loads. However, it turned out the easier to treat sources have been controlled, and the more difficult sources continue to plague our waterways. Unfortunately, many proposals to address the issues have been sources of political battles.